Hi everyone, so today we're going to talk about chord scales and what they are, and then we're going to start jumping right in by getting into some of the modes of major. So in what I'd like to call, conventional harmony, in other words, sort of like non-modal jazz harmony, functional harmony, there's generally about 12 scales that we look to, and these include some, modes of major, modes of melodic minor, and some of the symmetrical scales. Well, let's jump right into it. What is a chord scale? Well, a chord, think about it. I mean, a chord really could be, some sort of scale. If I play a chord over here, right, and I add some extensions on it, there's a major scale. So it's like, there's a major scale kind of standing up, and here it is in a linear fashion. Okay, so there's this sort of dichotomy between a scale and a chord. What do we use for chord scales? Well, pretty much any scale that does not contain more than two consecutive half steps. So the major scale is actually a really good candidate here. There's one half step there and a half step there, and they are not consecutive. Another familiar scale that we tend to play a lot is this one, which is the good old blues scale. This is not a really good chord scale because it has these two consecutive half steps together, and if you try to make harmony just by using those couple of notes, you run into some trouble. And so we're going to detail that a little bit better as we go along here. So that's kind of one of the biggest points. If you have a chord scale that is useful, it tends to create useful harmonies for us. And once again, like I mentioned before, there's 12 chord scales that we derive from four parent scales: major, melodic minor, diminished, and whole tone. Actually, we're going to throw augmented in there too. So we're going to learn these scales. We're going to learn all 12 of those scales in all 12 keys over the semester, and you're going to be happy that you did it, because this is a very important concept when we try to improvise in jazz. It adds a lot of color to our playing. So let's take a look at the modes of major. Let's just jump right into that. So here's a C major scale. When we talk about it in a modal sense, we talk about it as the Ionian scale. In other words, this is the first mode of major. And I already played the scale for you there, and then I played this sort of what I call a stacked version. And this is a way that we can sort of look at these scales in a chord sort of way. So here's, in Western harmony, we tend to organize chords in a tertian manner. In other words, we create chords out of third intervals. Now in jazz, actually, a lot of the better voicings tend to not be all thirds. We tend to mix thirds and fourths and fifths. But for now, and just to sort of keep track of all these different scales, we're going to use this stacked version. So there's a C major scale in that stacked version onto your right. Now, it doesn't sound very good, does it? It just doesn't sound very good. We're going to figure that out, why that is, in a second. But let's talk about some other ways that you can think of a scale. So like this scale, there's a couple different ways we can think of it. We could think of it in terms of whole steps and half steps. So there's two whole steps, right? Half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So that's one way we could describe that particular scale. Every major scale has that same structure. If you're a tetrachord kind of person, which I'm not really a tetrachord kind of person, but it's actually kind of a neat way to look at these scales too. So a tetrachord is like a 4-note fragment like this. And, for lack of a better term, I would call that a major tetrachord, right? It's like the first 4 notes of a major scale. Well, look at this. So the C major scale actually has 2 of those major tetrachords a whole step apart in the middle. Right? We also call this the reference scale because we tend to describe all the other scales in terms of this particular scale. I mean, let's face it, this is the most common scale that we deal with in pretty much all of Western music. So getting back to that stack version, I like to consider, if you look on your screen there, it says C major 7, natural 9, natural 11, natural 13. That is what I would call a chord inventory of the scale. So that's telling us, first of all, it's telling us the basic chord, which in this case is C major 7, right? C major 7 is a major 7th chord is a chord that has a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a major 7th in it. And then if you keep going up the scale and add notes in a tertian manner, you get a natural 9, a natural 11, and a natural 13. And, you know, I mean, one of the ways we can think of those is these are the notes that occupy those areas in the major scale. So when I say natural 9, we could think of, okay, what would be the 9th in that major scale above that root? So if I have a C, it's going to be a D. So that maybe that's a way we could think of some of these intervals when we name them later. But here's the thing. This chord doesn't sound so good, does it? I'm going to take it down an octave here. There's just something about that chord that does not sound right. Does anybody see what that might be? Well, I'll tell you what. Here's the thing that really sounds to me pretty bad in this chord. Okay, so this E, which is the 3rd of the chord, to this F up here is what we call a flat 9 interval. And they tend to sound pretty bad. So this is what's called an avoid tone. So if we have a C major 7 chord sounding, and I say to you, well, hey, guess what? The major scale is actually a really nice chord, or excuse me, a really nice scale to play over that C major 7 chord. But you have to be careful of the F because it's an avoid tone. In other words, if I'm improvising on this, I could play a bunch of those notes and be really, really hip and sound good, right? But as soon as I kind of like, see, I wouldn't sit on that note, would I? Right? So there's a couple different ways that we can avoid this note, or deal with avoid tones is actually what I meant to say. So they don't sound good because flat 9 intervals tend to sound bad. My teacher Gary Lindsay says they sound unstable, which maybe is a more politically correct way of putting it, but I don't like the way they sound. So I tend to avoid them, hence the name avoid tones. Here's a definition of an avoid tone. This is going to be important as we look at these moving forward. So an avoid tone is a tone in a chord scale. So this one happens to be in a chord scale. It's in the C major scale or the C Ionian scale that forms a flat 9 interval with a basic chord tone. So once again, that's the basic 7th chord. Those 4 notes are known as the basic chord tones, right? So this F fits that definition because it forms that flat 9 interval with the basic chord tone, right? Okay. Here's the really funny and weird thing about this. Check this out. Are there any other avoid tones? So let's look at this basic chord again. C major 7. Okay. Now in the C major scale or the C Ionian scale, are there any other notes that you could play that would form a flat 9 interval with one of these basic chord tones? Well, let's go up the scale, right? So there's the root. That's forming a half step with this note here, and that's not so bad. D's a beautiful note. E's one of the notes in the chord scale. There's that F. We know that's an avoid tone. G's a basic tone. This A is beautiful, right? It's a natural 9 above that G. There's the chord tone. But check this out. Isn't that strange? So this is the root of the chord, right? A C. Now I'm playing it in what's called the upper register. But look what it's doing. It's forming that flat 9 interval with the B. Therefore, it doesn't sound very good. So that is actually an avoid tone, and we have a special name for that particular avoid tone, and it's going to show up in some other chords as well. It's called an upper register root, otherwise known as a URR. Okay? Isn't that weird? So, maybe just a quick aside here, when a tune ends on the root, which happens very, very often, right? Good harmony, harmony players like, piano players or guitar players, they generally will adjust the quality of whatever their one chord is they're playing. So like a very, common thing is if there's a root on the end, maybe they'll change the quality of that chord to a 6/9 chord. And that avoids that whole idea of the avoid tone, right? And still sounds very nice as a one chord. Okay? All right, so we want to avoid in the major scale the 11 and the upper register root. So, thing is though, we can play an F on a C major 7 chord. We just have to deal with it in a certain way. Now, harmonically, we generally just leave it out. Like if we see C major 13 in our music, it's just understood that that chord does not have an F in it, right? Because it's going to form that flat 9 interval. You can force it in there via, actually adding an 11 to your chord, but, there are ways to do it. There's actually a modal way to do it, which we'll look at in a second. But in conventional harmony, we tend to not do it. So, there is an exception, however. In a dominant chord, flat 9 intervals tend to sound pretty good. And just as an example, look, there's a C7 chord with a flat 9. And, minor harmony wouldn't be anywhere without that flat 9. So the dominant chords, for some reason, are an exception to this rule. And I think it has to do with the function of them, the tension they build, and also maybe the tritone that's in there. But we'll come back to that when we start talking about some dominant chords. Just for the future, because you're going to need to remember this fact pretty soon, a sus chord could actually be considered a dominant. So once again, for the modal sound, we can move that avoid tone to the lower register. So, like I said before, melodically, we don't emphasize them like that, right? They work great as passing tones, though, right? If I use it like this, or, right? In other words, just sort of passing through the note to go from, chord tone to chord tone, or extension to extension, that works fine. It's just, we just don't want to sit there and bang on it, okay? Then we lose the sound of that particular chord. Okay. Here's the thing, we could actually, so what if we just took them out, right? So say we have the C major scale, and, you're saying, okay, well, if, that F doesn't sound so good, and the upper register C doesn't sound so good, what if I just take them out of the scale? And guess what? This is what you're left with if you do that. Which is what? What kind of scale is that? Well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes in that scale. A 5-note scale is known as a pentatonic scale. In this case, though, we would root this pentatonic scale here on a G. So actually, what we end up with is a G pentatonic scale. So here's the thing. Check this out. So any note in that G major pentatonic scale is kind of a safe note, right? And it sounds really nice on that major 7th chord. But thing is, if you play that pentatonic scale, and incidentally, you can find this on any major 7th chord, it's off of the 5th. So if you had A flat major 7, for instance, what would be your major pentatonic? It would be an E flat major pentatonic scale. So if I played A flat major 7, that sounds really nice on there. However, if you did that every single time, it would kind of get a little bit boring. It's got kind of a vanilla sound to it, right? Okay. So, before we kind of move on from the Ionian scale here, let's just talk about some different ways that chords are voiced as far as the Ionian chords / scale is. So generally, if any of these chords show up in our music, we can use that major scale, that Ionian scale. But we have to be a little careful about the avoid tones. But in some cases, we don't have to be as careful as others. So, for instance, look at these first 3 voicings here. So I'm not super fond of this first voicing. It's not spaced very nicely. But there's a C major 7 chord, right? So, that's just got the basic 4 notes in it. I mean, we could easily voice it like that too. Let's just spread out a little bit more. So here we do have to be concerned about that F, and we have to be concerned about the upper register root when we're improvising over just a major 7th chord, right? Same thing even if we add in that 9th. So one of the reasons I voiced that first chord the way I did is you'll notice that when we add that 9th in there, we actually get this beautiful G triad in our right hand. 3rd and 7th are down low. It starts to sound a little bit more jazzy at that point, right? Here's another pretty cool way of voicing a C major 7 chord, but adding in the other extensions. So there's a C major 13 chord. So that has all of the notes of the C major scale in it except for that F, right? Once again, though, if I play this F here, I end up with that flat 9 interval. If I play it here, I end up with that flat 9 interval. So we have to be careful anytime we see that MA symbol or MAJ. I wish they would. I wish the jazz police would come along and just say, "This is the way that chord symbols are. Period. End of story." But guess what? You're going to encounter all different ways of interpreting chord symbols, and that's maybe a subject for another video. Now, Ionian chords generally are 1 chords. Sometimes we're going to see maybe this sort of version of the 1 chord, which is like a C6 chord. A lot of times maybe you'll see it like this. It's got that sort of little bit old-timey sort of sound to it, or that sort of ta-da kind of feel like ta-da. Anyway, you add a 9th to it, you get this beautiful 6/9 sound, very similar to what I was playing, as the end of the tune before when we were talking about having that root on the top. Now this one, we don't have to worry about that upper register root, right? Because there is no major 7th in this voicing. So we're only worried about that F, right, as our avoid tone there. So remember before that I started talking about that when we think of maybe this chord scale in a modal sort of way, we can actually voice it with the 4th in there. So if you take a look at the last example on this page, what we did is we took the F and we moved it down an octave in the voicing. So here's my root, here's my 4th, and we also are going to put the 3rd in this chord as well. Next note I would put in there would be the major 7th, and actually let's just hear what it sounds like with those 4 notes in it. That sounds very pretty, doesn't it? Right? But that does not, to me, that's not a 1 chord. That's something else, isn't it? Right? Like if I try to do a 2/5 to that, well here, I'll do a 2/5 to C major. Right? So that makes sense to our ears, right? Quite right, is it? It's very pretty. It's not quite right. For you jazz composition type folks, I would encourage you to explore voicings like that, and they're very pretty and very unusual sounding. So don't discount them just because we're not going to really look at that in this class very much. Anyway, this, once again, these chords usually function as a 1 in a key or in a temporary key center, right? I mean, jazz tunes tend to shift keys quite often. So this is our usual one major chord. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on to the second mode of major. And this is, the second mode is known as Dorian. So when you're talking about modes, in other words, you're just taking that major scale or whatever your parent scale is, So the major scale is the parent scale in this particular instance. And you just start on a different note. So instead of starting on C, I'm going to start on D and play that same set of notes. So there's a Dorian scale, right? And just like the Ionian scale, what we can do is we can create a stacked version of it. This is actually an octave down from my example there, but that actually sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? Let's figure out, well, we'll figure out why that sounds nice in a second, but let's study the scale using our couple of criteria here. So once again, we could compare this to the major scale, which we'll do in a second, but we can also think about it in terms of whole steps and half steps. So this one's a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step. Tetrachords in here if you're into that type of thing. There's what I'd call a minor tetrachord. So that's interesting, isn't it, right? So our Ionian scale was 2 major tetrachords a whole step apart. A Dorian scale is 2 minor tetrachords a whole step apart. If you wanted to talk about this scale in terms of the major scale, it's like a major scale with a flatted 3 and a flatted 7, right? If I played a D major scale, and I flatted this 7 and I flatted this 3, I would get that Dorian scale, right? And once again, here's our associated chord. D minor 7th, that's the basic chord, right? So a minor 7th chord is one that has a minor 3rd, perfect 5th, and a minor 7th in it. And then we go up the extensions here. Natural 9, natural 11, natural 13. Once again, if we had thought of those 3 notes as coming from the D major scale, they would actually be in that D major scale. So we call them natural for that reason. So, guess what? This scale has no avoid tones in it. So let's think about that definition of an avoid tone for a second. Remember, it's a note in the scale that can form a flat 9 interval with one of the basic chord tones. So here's our basic chord, right? And let's go through the scale. See? Major 9th, major 9th, major 9th, major 9th. There's no possible way in that particular scale to come up with a flat 9 interval above the basic chord here. So therefore, there are no avoid tones. So we can play that scale all day on a minor 7th chord. And that's why when we come to a minor 7th chord in our improvisation, this tends to be the best scale. Now, when we're creating melodies, our ears may draw us to a different scale for a minor 7th chord depending on where that minor scale fits in the chord progression. For instance, in a 3-6-2-5 chord progression, it's not very unusual to hear maybe the Phrygian scale on the 3 chord because we're kind of working our way back to 1, and so maybe your melodic tendency is to play a flat 9 on that chord as opposed to a natural 9. But here's the thing, if I play a flat 9 and I sit on it on a minor 7th chord, it just doesn't sound very good. Now once again, I could pass through that note and it sounds fine. So just something to keep in mind in the future, because we're going to see some other minor 7th chords here. All right. Speaking of other minor 7th chords, let's look at the some of the voicings of your Dorian chords here before we move on. So once again, D minor 7, there's our basic 7th chord all the way to the left there. Here's where, this is probably the most common sort of voicing when you find a when you find a minor 7th chord. Usually people are inclined to put that natural 9 in there because it just adds some beautiful color. There's this beautiful major 7th interval. Isn't it interesting how a major 7th interval sounds very nice, whereas flat 9 interval, if you invert it, doesn't sound as good, right? You guys know the tune So What? So here's the famous So What voicing. F triad in your right hand, an 11th in your left hand there, and then you can actually do this. So there's your so what voicing. And here, there is no 9th in that so what voicing, right? This one here where we add maybe that 13 in there is not quite as common. The reason that's not quite as common is this. When we go from D minor 9 or D minor 7, which usually functions as a 2 chord, and we resolve to the dominant, you'll notice, look at my right hand here, only one note changes, and that, in this case, is going to the B. So if we voice our minor 7th chord with that B in there, it kind of ruins the traveling to the next chord, because that is like the primary voice leading in a 2-5, right? To go from that 7 to the 3 of the 5 chord. So we generally don't, include that 13 in our minor 7th voicings unless it's a modal chord. So just keep that in mind. But once again, in conventional, what we call conventional harmony, these chords usually function as a 2 minor 7 in a key, or, once again, a temporary key center. It's a way that we can start going to a different key center. Okay, next chord scale, remember chords are scales, scales are chords, is called the Phrygian scale, and this is the 3rd mode of major. So in other words, if I start my major scale, there's my C major scale, if I started on E, you get a Phrygian scale. Now I love this scale, and I love some of the harmony that is associated with this, but there's some big problems with this. Let's just analyze it though before we get into that. So this scale starts with a half step, right, which tends to give it a very dark sound. I mean, incidentally, one of the things you could think of is the more notes that are closer this way to the root, the darker that scale tends to sound, right? And the more that are farther from the root this way tend to be brighter sounding scales. We're actually going to end this video on the bright sounding scale. So look, here's half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. I mean, for lack of a better term there, I'd call those 4 notes a Phrygian tetrachord. Check it out. There's that symmetry again, right? Phrygian tetrachord, both a whole step apart. That's another way that we can define that chord. Here's where we run into an issue, though. Look. We can stack that chord up, and in our left hand, we get an E minor 7 chord. But then we get a flat 9, natural 11, which is okay, but then a flat 13. By definition, those 2 notes there, the F and the C in this case, are avoid tones, right? But here's the thing, we could actually, yuck, we can actually move this chord around like we did with that modal Ionian chord and make it work. So, as I mentioned before, remember towards the beginning when we started talking about avoid tones, we said that flat 9 intervals are okay on a dominant chord. So think about this for a second, maybe even pause the video. Can we rearrange the notes in this Phrygian scale and turn it into a dominant chord? Think about that for a second. So here's the way we can do it. We can actually take this original structure here and move some of the notes around. So remember before, like we moved the F down. So if we take this note here, and this is a little bit of sleight of hand, I kind of feel. We take this G here and move it up an octave. Now we're going to consider that note, instead of a minor 3rd, we're going to consider that note a sharp 9. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take the A here, we're going to move that down an octave. So now look at our basic chord in our left hand there. It's an E7 sus, right? In other words, sus means that the 4, the natural 4, is taking the place of the 3. So there's our basic chord. Now, so technically that's a dominant, isn't it? Right? Then these 3 other notes become extensions. Now this particular chord here, when I play the whole thing together, to me it still doesn't sound that great. It's still got some issues with it. We still have a B to an A here. We do have this flat 9 somehow not as bad, right? It's not quite as bad as this version here, right? Anyway, usually though, we'll voice this chord maybe with one of these extensions. That's the most common one. And check this out. In the third example there, if I play a B half diminished chord in my right hand and an E in my left, we actually get a really, really nice version of that Phrygian chord. And so this Phrygian chord usually will do this, right? It's kind of a suspended version of E7 flat 9, right? Right? B half diminished over E, otherwise known as E7 sus flat 9. And then E, we would get that maybe resolving here, right, to A minor, right? The modal version's really cool though, and I love the modal version. We're actually going to see this chord in a second, but this is like I would call this a Lydian grip, starting on an F. We put that over an E in the bass. Ooh, that sounds really nice. There's a couple of really cool jazz tunes that are based on that particular sound. I've actually written quite a few based on that sound. I can't get away from it. So good. Anyway, but once again, that's not a chord that we hear in conventional harmony very much. This one we do hear quite often, right? So like with an E pedal point, if we're doing a minor 2-5 over an E pedal point, that's what we get there. Okay, so usually it's like I said, it's like a predominant, right? Not as common. Okay, we're going to do one more and then we'll take a break. So the fourth mode of major is known as the Lydian scale. And so in other words, here's our C major scale. If we start that scale on the fourth note, it sounds really close to a major scale, doesn't it? But there's one note difference. So this is 3 whole steps in a row. Half step, whole step, half step. This one is not quite as symmetrical, right? Look. We get what I think, for lack of a better term, a Lydian tetrachord. And then a major tetrachord. But now they're a half step apart, right? Yeah, if we look at this in terms of a major scale, it's like an F major scale with a sharp 4 on it, right? Or actually, we're going to call it a sharp 11. So the stacked version of this actually sounds pretty nice, doesn't it, right? Because guess what? By having the sharp 4 in there, we no longer have that flat 9 interval. So this one actually is really, really nice, right? Now, we still have to avoid the upper register root, right? Isn't that weird, right? It's so weird, right? But it just doesn't sound very good when you play that root in the upper register because it forms that flat 9 interval with the major 7th, right? So, I mean, does this solve our Ionian problem? I mean, every time now we come to a major 7th chord, should we just play Lydian? As I say in my class, if you want to be sharp 11 Johnny, yes, that's what you do. But no, I mean, seriously, we're not always going to play that color. It's a beautiful color. I mean, it's a beautiful note, beautiful color. But, once again, I think you'd sound a little repetitious, if that's a name, if that's a word, if you just play that, that sort of mode every time on a major 7th chord. So, in other words, I'm saying this is something to stick in our bag of tricks, right? So let's look at some Lydian chords here. So once again, any major 7th chord you could play the Lydian scale on. So like for instance, I'm going to go back to C major 7. Right, there's my sharp 11. Sounds very nice, right? Here's an F major 9 chord, right? Lydian's going to sound really nice on that, right? F major 13, right? So the first 3 on this page are voicings that we share with the Ionian mode. But as soon as you add that sharp 11 in there, right, it firmly puts them in that Lydian sound, right? So the sort of bare bones one, which I just showed you on the Phrygian chord. Matter of fact, if I put this F up an octave like this is what I call, or actually what my teachers called, and I call now, a Lydian grip. And I call it a grip, we call it a grip, because it kind of looks like you're gripping something, right? It's my grip, it's my superpower. Lydian grip, superpower. So that's kind of the bare bones, you know, Lydian sort of sound. This is a chord that has just the root, the third, the major 7, and that sharp 11 in there. We can then add to that, you know, the 9 on top. And then this is my favorite voicing right here, where you have that beautiful G triad on the top. Right? That's a really nice one. So these usually function, they can function as a 1, right? You can have a 1 with that sharp 11 color in it. Or more often, you know, it'll function maybe as a 4 in a key. Has a very, very distinct sound though, and you know, we're going to use that Lydian scale when we want that color of that bright 4th. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video right now. We're going to pick up with Mixolydian the next time, so we'll see you then.